Story 1. The Mile That Stretches. Thomas Kellerman had been driving commercial trucks for 19 years, and in all that time he'd never questioned the basic laws of distance and time. At 44, he knew every major highway between Chicago and Denver like the back of his hand, could estimate arrival times down to the quarter hour, and prided himself on his reliability. The road was predictable, logical, measurable. Until March of 2023, when Thomas discovered that some miles don't behave the way they should. He was hauling refrigerated produce from Omaha to Salt Lake City, taking I-80 west through Nebraska on a clear Tuesday afternoon. Traffic was light, weather perfect, and Thomas had his cruise control set at exactly 67 miles per hour. He'd driven this particular stretch hundreds of times, knew every exit, every rest stop, every landmark along the way. Around 3 p.m., somewhere between North Platte and Ogallala, Thomas noticed mile marker 164. Nothing unusual about it, just a standard green sign marking the distance. But as he continued driving, checking his mirrors and adjusting his radio, he passed mile marker 164 again. Then again, and again. At first, Thomas assumed he was mistaken, that the markers were closer together than usual, or that he'd misread them. But after the 7th time passing the identical marker, same slight rust stain on the bottom right corner, same bent post leaning 5 degrees to the left, he knew something was wrong. Thomas checked his odometer. It showed he'd traveled 12 miles since he first noticed the marker. His GPS confirmed his speed at 67 miles per hour. His fuel gauge showed appropriate consumption, and his clock ticked forward normally. Every instrument insisted he was moving forward through space, yet mile marker 164 kept appearing over and over like a skip in a record. He grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19. This is rolling thunder to any eastbound traffic on I-80 near North Platte. Anyone copy? Static crackled for a moment, then a voice responded. This is Desert Fox eastbound at mile marker 172. What's your 20, rolling thunder? That's the thing, Thomas said, his voice tight. I'm stuck at mile marker 164. I keep passing it, but I'm not making any forward progress. You see any westbound traffic near your position? Long pause. Negative, rolling thunder. I've got clear road for miles in both directions. You sure about your location? Thomas looked out his windshield at the endless Nebraska plains, the pale grass waving in the wind, the cloudless sky stretching to the horizon. Yeah, I'm sure. And it's getting weirder. Stand by. Because it was getting weirder. Thomas had now passed mile marker 164 at least 20 times. He'd been driving for 30 minutes since first noticing the phenomenon, which meant he should have covered over 30 miles. Instead, he was trapped in a loop of less than 100 yards, passing the same marker repeatedly while every system in his truck insisted he was moving forward at highway speed. Thomas tried slowing down, 40 miles per hour. Mile marker 164, 30 miles per hour. Mile marker 164. He sped up to 75. Mile marker 164. The speed didn't matter. The distance didn't change. He was moving through space without making any progress, like running on a treadmill that looked like a highway. He tried switching lanes. The mile marker appeared in his windshield regardless of which lane he occupied. He tried to exit at the upcoming off-ramp. He'd seen the sign for it dozens of times now, advertising a rest area 2 miles ahead. But the exit never arrived, just mile marker 164 repeating endlessly. Thomas pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. He got out of his truck, his legs unsteady after the disorienting experience. The air was still almost oppressively quiet. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic sounds, just silence pressing in from all sides. He walked back to mile marker 164, which stood about 50 yards behind where he'd parked. The post was real. Solid metal anchored in concrete. The sign was real, weathered and sun-faded. Thomas touched it, ran his fingers over the embossed numbers. Everything felt normal. He looked back at his truck. Then he looked ahead. The highway stretched into the distance, arrow straight, apparently infinite. Behind him, the road looked identical. No curves, no landmarks, no variation. Just road and grass and sky. Thomas walked back to his truck and tried calling dispatch on his cell phone. No signal. He tried his satellite communicator. No connection. Every form of communication except the CB radio had stopped working. He climbed back into his cab and started driving again. Maybe if he pushed through, if he kept going long enough, he'd break through whatever was causing this loop. Mile marker 164 appeared, and appeared, and appeared. After another hour of this, 60 miles on his odometer with zero actual progress, Thomas noticed something else. The sun hadn't moved. It hung in the same position in the sky, casting the same shadows, creating the same pattern of light and dark across the dashboard. Time was passing according to his clock, but the sun disagreed. The CB crackled. "Rolling Thunder, this is Desert Fox. You still out there?" Thomas grabbed the mic. "Yeah, I'm here, still stuck at mile marker 164. How far have you gotten?" "That's the thing, brother. I'm stuck at mile marker 172. Been passing it for the last hour. Can't make any progress. And I just heard from 2 other drivers on this channel. One stuck at marker 151, another at marker 189. Something's wrong with this whole stretch of highway." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "How many of us are there?" Over the next 10 minutes, 7 different truckers reported in, each one trapped at a different mile marker on I-80, each one experiencing the same impossible loop. They were scattered across nearly 40 miles of highway, all of them driving forward without making progress, all of them trapped in sections of road that repeated endlessly. "Anyone tried stopping for more than a few minutes?" Thomas asked. A woman's voice responded, "This is North Star. I stopped for 20 minutes, got out, walked around. When I started driving again, nothing changed. Still stuck at mile marker 157. Thomas checked his fuel gauge. 3/4 full when this started, now showing just under half. The truck was consuming fuel normally, which meant his engine was working, his wheels were turning, everything was functioning as it should. Except he wasn't going anywhere. As the afternoon wore on, according to his clock, though the sun remained frozen, the other trapped truckers began to panic. Some tried ramming through, pushing their engines to maximum speed. Others attempted to turn around and backtrack. Nothing worked. The mile markers were prison cells, each one containing a driver who couldn't escape. Thomas noticed something else. The landscape was changing. Subtly at first, then more obviously. The grass was growing taller. The sky was developing clouds that hadn't been there before. A farmhouse that had been distant was now closer, though he hadn't moved toward it. The world outside his loop was progressing normally while he remained frozen in place. "Rolling Thunder to all trapped drivers," Thomas called. "Is your environment changing?" Affirmative responses came back. Everyone was seeing their surroundings shift and evolve while they remained stationary, driving endless circles through the same 100 yards of highway. Then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Thomas passed mile marker 164 and saw mile marker 165 ahead, then 166, then 167. He was moving forward again, making actual progress. His CB lit up with excited chatter as the other trapped drivers reported the same thing. They were free, released from whatever had held them. Thomas drove straight through to Salt Lake City, pushing his hours, not stopping until he'd crossed into Utah. When he finally pulled into a rest area, he checked his logbook. According to his electronic logging device, he'd spent 4 hours at mile marker 164, covering 0 miles while burning fuel and running his engine. He called dispatch and tried to explain. They were skeptical but concerned. Thomas had never been late before, never filed a false report, never given them reason to doubt him. They accepted his explanation without really believing it, marking the lost time as a mechanical issue to avoid logging violations. Thomas finished his delivery and drove back through Nebraska on I-80. When he reached mile marker 164, he held his breath, gripping the wheel tight. But he passed it normally, watched it recede in his mirrors, saw mile marker 163 appear behind him. He never learned what caused the phenomenon or why it released him. None of the 7 trapped truckers could explain it, but Thomas knows it was real. His truck's data recorder shows 4 hours of operation with 0 distance traveled. His fuel log confirms consumption without corresponding mileage. And somewhere in the digital records of the highway system, there's a 4-hour gap where 7 trucks simply stopped existing on I-80, removed from the flow of traffic, trapped in loops that shouldn't be possible. Thomas still drives that route. He has no choice. It's his job, his livelihood. But every time he approaches mile marker 164, his hands tighten on the wheel and he watches his odometer obsessively, making sure each mile marker is different from the last, terrified that he'll once again find himself trapped in the mile that stretches endlessly forward while going nowhere at all. Story 2. The truck stop that wasn't there. Patricia Sullivan had been a long-haul trucker for 22 years, running routes across the western United States with the kind of efficiency and professionalism that made her a favorite among dispatchers. At 47, she'd stopped counting how many miles she'd driven, how many nights she'd spent in truck stop parking lots, how many cups of terrible coffee she'd consumed at 3 a.m. to stay alert. The job was her life, and she was good at it. Until May of 2023, when Patricia stopped at a truck stop that changed everything she thought she knew about the roads she traveled. She was hauling electronics from Seattle to Phoenix, taking I-84 to I-15, a route she'd driven at least twice a month for the past decade. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and Patricia was approaching the Utah-Arizona border, tired and in need of a break. Her logbook showed she had 90 minutes left on her driving clock, but her body was telling her she needed rest sooner. That's when she saw the sign. Last chance fuel and food. Exit 42, 2 miles. Patricia didn't remember an exit 42, but truck stops came and went, closed and reopened under new management. The sign looked professional enough, with proper DOT highway markers and reflective lettering. She decided to stop. The exit came up right where the sign promised. Patricia took it, following a winding access road through desert scrub for about a mile. The truck stop appeared suddenly, fully lit, with a large parking lot that could accommodate 50 trucks. The main building was modern, glass and steel, with "Last Chance" written in blue neon across the entrance. A dozen trucks were parked in neat rows, and Patricia could see people moving around inside the brightly lit convenience store. She pulled into a parking spot, killed her engine, and grabbed her jacket. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of diesel and sage. Patricia walked toward the building, her boots crunching on new asphalt. Everything about the place seemed normal, even pleasant, a welcome oasis in the middle of nowhere. The convenience store was clean and well-stocked. A middle-aged woman stood behind the counter, smiling. "Welcome to Last Chance. Let me know if you need anything." Patricia nodded and headed for the coffee station. As she poured herself a cup, she glanced around at the other customers. 3 truckers were browsing the aisles, a couple sat at a small table eating sandwiches, and a lone man stood by the magazine rack. All perfectly normal except for one small detail that Patricia couldn't quite identify. Something about the way they moved, the way they didn't make eye contact, the way they seemed to be performing the role of truck stop customers rather than actually being them. Patricia paid for her coffee and asked the cashier, "When did this place open?" I drive this route all the time and don't remember seeing it before. The woman's smile didn't waver. We've been here a long time. Maybe you just never needed to stop before. Patricia walked back to her truck, coffee in hand, and climbed into her cab. She pulled out her phone to check messages, but she had no signal. Not unusual in rural areas, though she thought she'd had at least 2 bars when she took the exit. She tried her satellite communicator. Nothing. She decided to rest for 30 minutes, finish her coffee, and then get back on the road. But as she sat there, sipping the coffee and watching the truck stop through her windshield, she noticed something strange. The other trucks in the lot weren't moving. Not just parked. They were completely still. No slight rocking from drivers climbing in or out. No running lights blinking as engines idled. No signs of life at all. They looked like props, perfectly positioned but not quite real. Patricia got out of her truck and walked over to the nearest one, a red Kenworth with Oregon plates. She peered into the cab. Empty. She checked the next truck, a blue Peterbilt, also empty. One by one, she checked every visible truck in the lot. All of them were empty. No drivers, no personal belongings, no trash. No signs that anyone had ever actually driven them. But she'd seen people inside the convenience store. Where were their trucks? Patricia walked back to the building, her heart starting to beat faster. The couple was still at the table, eating the same sandwiches in the same positions. The man was still at the magazine rack, reading the same page. The 3 truckers were still browsing, their movements almost mechanical, repetitive. "Excuse me," Patricia said to one of the truckers, a heavy-set man in a faded baseball cap. "Which truck is yours?" He looked at her with glassy eyes and smiled. "Been here a long time," he said, echoing the cashier's words. "Maybe you just never needed to stop before." Patricia backed away, her skin crawling. She approached the cashier. "I need to leave. How do I get back to the highway?" The woman's smile widened. "You can leave anytime you want. Just go back the way you came." Patricia hurried to her truck, climbed in, started the engine. The familiar rumble of the diesel was comforting. She put the truck in gear and drove toward the exit, following the same winding access road back toward the highway. But the road didn't end. She drove for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The access road just kept going, winding through the desert, never reaching I-15. Patricia's GPS showed her truck moving, but it couldn't locate her position, just displayed a spinning icon indicating searching for signal. She tried the CB radio. "This is Nighthawk to any trucks on I-15. Does anyone copy?" Static, then faintly a voice. "Nighthawk, where are you?" "Last chance truck stop, exit 42. I can't find my way back to the highway." Long pause. "Nighthawk, there is no exit 42 on I-15 in this area, and I've never heard of last chance truck stop." Patricia's hands tightened on the wheel. She'd seen the signs. She'd stopped at the place. It was real. But the voice on the radio was insistent. There was no exit 42, no last chance, nothing where Patricia claimed to be. She kept driving, following the access road that seemed to go nowhere. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only 30 minutes according to her clock, she saw lights ahead. The highway. Patricia merged onto I-15 southbound and checked her mirrors. The exit she'd taken was behind her, but when she looked for the sign, it wasn't there. No last chance fuel and food, no exit 42, just empty desert and the occasional mile marker. Patricia drove straight through to Phoenix without stopping, too shaken to rest. When she arrived and was unloading, she mentioned the incident to another driver she knew, a veteran trucker named Bill who'd been running Western routes for 30 years. His face went pale. "Last chance? You stopped at last chance? You know it?" "It's a legend, a ghost truck stop. Drivers have reported seeing it for decades, usually when they're tired, usually at night. Some people say it's a trap, that drivers who stop there never leave. Others say it's some kind of temporal glitch, a place that exists but doesn't exist, appearing and disappearing. He looked at her seriously. "You're lucky you got out." Patricia researched obsessively over the next few days. She found scattered reports online, forum posts, and blog entries from truckers describing a place called Last Chance, always on different highways in different states, always appearing late at night, always seeming perfectly normal until you realize something was wrong. Most drivers who stopped there managed to leave, but some reports mentioned trucks found abandoned near the area, the drivers never located, as if they'd simply vanished. Patricia never saw Last Chance again, though she drove the same route dozens of times over the following months. She'd watch for exit 42, but it never appeared. Sometimes late at night, she'd see a sign that looked like it might say Last Chance. But when she got closer, it was always something else. A regular truck stop, a rest area, a town exit. But she kept the coffee cup. The one she'd purchased at Last Chance, plain white ceramic with LC stamped on the bottom. It sat on her dashboard, a reminder that not everything on the highway was what it appeared to be, that some places existed in the cracks between reality, offering rest to weary travelers but demanding something in return. Though Patricia never quite figured out what that was. She knows she was supposed to stay. The empty trucks, the looping access road, the people who moved like automatons. It was all designed to keep her there, to add her truck to the collection of abandoned vehicles, to make her one of the mechanical customers who repeat the same actions forever. But Patricia had left, had found her way back to the real highway, had escaped. Still, she wonders about the other drivers who stopped at Last Chance and didn't leave. Are they still there? Trapped in that impossible truck stop, forever browsing aisles and drinking coffee that never gets cold, performing the role of traveler without ever moving again? And if Last Chance appears to her again, showing up unexpectedly on a dark highway when she's tired and needs rest, will she recognize it in time? Or will she stop, thinking this time is different, only to find herself trapped forever in the truck stop that wasn't there? Story 3. The Cargo That Moves. David Chen had been an owner-operator for 15 years, and he'd hauled just about everything a truck could carry, from produce to furniture to hazardous materials. At 39, he prided himself on his versatility and his willingness to take odd jobs that other drivers avoided. Higher rates for unusual cargo meant he could make his truck payments and still have money left over. But in July of 2023, David accepted a load that made him reconsider his haul-anything philosophy. The job came through a broker he'd worked with a few times before. Special cargo, Chicago to Portland, must maintain temperature at exactly 68 degrees, no exceptions. Pay is triple your usual rate. David agreed immediately. Triple rate for a temperature-controlled load? That was easy money. The pickup was at a warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, an unmarked building surrounded by high fences. David backed his trailer up to the loading dock and waited while workers in hazmat suits loaded 6 identical crates, each about the size of a refrigerator. The crates were sealed with complex locking mechanisms and covered in warning labels he didn't recognize, not the standard hazmat placards, but something else. Symbols he'd never seen before. "What's in them?" David asked the supervisor. "Biological specimens, research materials. Just keep the trailer at 68 degrees and don't open the crates under any circumstances. If the temperature varies by more than 2 degrees in either direction, call this number immediately." The supervisor handed him a card with a phone number and nothing else. David secured the cargo, checked his refrigeration unit, and headed west. The drive started normally enough. He took I-90 through Wisconsin, watching his trailer temperature gauge obsessively, making sure it stayed locked at exactly 68 degrees. His reefer unit was new and reliable, so he wasn't worried about maintaining temperature. But around midnight, somewhere in South Dakota, David heard something from his trailer. A sound like movement, like something shifting inside the cargo area. He checked his mirrors. Everything looked normal. He pulled over at a rest area and walked back to inspect the trailer. The temperature was perfect at 68 degrees. The door was sealed. But when David pressed his ear against the side of the trailer, he could hear it. A rustling sound, like something moving around inside, not mechanical movement, but organic, purposeful, alive. David called the number on the card. It rang 6 times before someone answered. Yes? This is David Chen. I'm hauling your cargo from Chicago to Portland. There's something moving inside the crates. That's expected. Ignore it. Just maintain the temperature and continue to your destination. What am I hauling? Those crates shouldn't... Mr. Chen, you're being paid triple your usual rate specifically because you don't ask questions. The cargo is secure. The movement is normal. Drive to Portland. The line went dead. David stood in the parking lot staring at his trailer. The movement was normal? What kind of biological specimens moved around inside sealed crates? And why the specific temperature requirement? He got back in his truck and continued driving, trying to ignore the occasional sounds from the trailer. But as the night wore on, the sounds got louder and more frequent. Not just rustling now, but something that sounded like scratching, like whatever was in those crates was trying to get out. Around 3 a.m., David's trailer temperature alarm went off. He checked the gauge, 69 degrees, 1 degree over the limit. He immediately adjusted the refrigeration unit, bringing it back to 68. But in that 1 degree variation, something changed. The movement in the trailer became violent. David could feel it, the whole trailer rocking slightly as something inside thrashed around. He pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and watched in horror as his trailer shook, the entire rig swaying with the force of whatever was inside. Then it stopped. The temperature stabilized at 68 degrees, and the violent movement ceased, returning to the occasional rustling David had heard earlier. He called the number again. The temperature went to 69 for about 30 seconds, and the cargo went crazy. What the hell am I hauling? Mr. Chen, you need to maintain exact temperature. Variations cause stress to the specimens. They're in a suspended state, kept docile by the cold. If the temperature rises too much, they become active. If it drops too much, they die, and you don't want that to happen while they're in your trailer, trust me. What are they? Classified research, that's all you need to know. Get them to Portland, don't let the temperature vary again. David drove through the night with his hands cramped on the wheel, his eyes flicking between the road and the temperature gauge every few seconds. The specimens in his trailer were alive, intelligent enough to respond to temperature changes, dangerous enough to make the handler warn him against letting them die while in transit. He was hauling something that probably shouldn't be transported on public highways, something that made him complicit in God knows what kind of illegal research. But he needed the money, and he'd already accepted the job. So he drove. Montana passed in a blur of anxiety. Idaho was worse. David stopped only for fuel, rushing through the process, terrified that something would malfunction and the temperature would spike or drop. Every time he heard movement from the trailer, his heart rate jumped. Every time the trailer rocked slightly, he imagined the crates breaking open, whatever was inside spilling out onto the highway. In eastern Oregon, another driver pulled alongside him at a truck stop and gestured to the trailer. David rolled down his window. "Hey, buddy, your trailer's leaking something. Thought you should know." David jumped out and ran to the back of his trailer. Dark fluid was seeping from the door seal, dripping onto the asphalt. It smelled wrong, organic but chemical, like formaldehyde mixed with rot. David called the number again. There's fluid leaking from my trailer. What color? Dark brown, almost black. Pause. That's concerning. One of the specimens may have breached containment. You need to get to Portland immediately. Don't stop. Don't let anyone inspect your cargo. Drive straight through. What if the temperature... Keep it at 68 degrees no matter what. If that specimen is loose in your trailer and the temperature rises, you'll have a very bad situation. Drive fast. David drove. He pushed his hours, violated his logbook, exceeded speed limits whenever he thought he could get away with it. The leaking got worse. By the time he reached the Columbia River Gorge, there was a visible trail of dark fluid marking his route, drops on the highway, a breadcrumb path leading straight to his truck. He reached Portland at dawn, following GPS coordinates to a facility that looked more like a military installation than a research lab. Armed guards met him at the gate, and hazmat-suited technicians swarmed his trailer immediately. They opened it carefully, and David caught a glimpse inside before they waved him away. 5 intact crates and one that had partially broken open, something pale and writhing visible through the crack. Something with too many limbs and not enough form. Something that shouldn't exist. They paid him in cash, triple rate plus a bonus for discretion. They made him sign forms promising never to discuss the cargo. They took his contact information and told him they'd be in touch if they needed him for future transport. David drove away, his trailer empty but still reeking of that chemical organic smell. He cleaned it 3 times, used industrial solvents, left it aired out for days. The smell faded but never completely disappeared. He never took another job from that broker, never hauled special cargo again. He went back to produce and furniture, boring loads that didn't move, didn't leak, didn't require him to maintain exact temperatures or risk releasing something horrible onto public highways. But David thinks about that night often. He wonders what happened to the thing that breached containment, whether they contained it or whether it escaped into the Oregon wilderness. He wonders what the other 5 crates held, what biological specimens would justify the secrecy, the armed guards, the desperate need to keep them at exactly 68 degrees. And he wonders how many other trucks are out there right now, hauling similar cargo driven by people like him who need the money and don't ask enough questions until it's too late. David's trailer still smells faintly wrong on hot days. And sometimes, late at night, he swears he can hear rustling from the empty cargo space, like something left a trace of itself behind. Like the movement he heard that night imprinted itself on the metal and insulation, repeating forever as a reminder of the cargo that should never have been moved. Story 4. The Driver Who Wasn't. Marcus Reed had been driving team routes for 8 years, always with the same partner, his brother-in-law James. They'd developed the kind of efficient rhythm that made them valuable to companies needing fast cross-country delivery. One drove while the other slept, 12-hour shifts, the truck constantly moving. At 33, Marcus knew James's habits as well as his own. Could predict when James would need coffee, when he'd want to stop for food, when he'd crack jokes to stay alert during boring stretches of highway. But in September of 2023, Marcus learned that familiarity doesn't always mean understanding, especially when the person you think you know stops being entirely human. They picked up a load in Atlanta heading to Seattle with auto parts. A 60-hour drive if they pushed it, 3 days if they were smart. James took the first shift, driving through Georgia and Tennessee while Marcus slept in the bunk. They switched in Nashville, Marcus taking over for the night drive through Kentucky and Indiana. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Marcus woke for his shift and climbed into the driver's seat. James headed to the sleeper berth, patting Marcus on the shoulder as he passed. A gesture he'd done 1,000 times before. But this time Marcus felt something strange. The hand was cold, colder than a human hand should be, and it lingered on his shoulder a fraction too long, the pressure slightly wrong, like someone trying to remember how humans typically touched each other. "You okay?" Marcus asked. James smiled. "Just tired. Wake me in Indy." Marcus drove through the night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, looking back at the curtain that separated the cab from the sleeper berth. No sound came from behind it. No snoring, no rustling, no signs of James settling in for sleep. Just silence. Around 3 a.m., somewhere in southern Indiana, Marcus heard James's voice from the sleeper berth. "Marcus, are you there?" "Yeah, I'm here. What's wrong?" I don't feel right. Something's wrong." Marcus pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. He opened the curtain to the sleeper berth. James was lying on the bunk, his eyes open but unfocused, staring at the ceiling. His skin was pale, almost gray. "James? What's going on?" James turned his head slowly, mechanically. "I don't know. I don't feel like myself. Since Nashville, something happened in Nashville." "What happened?" "I don't remember. I stopped at that rest area while you were sleeping. I was in the bathroom and there was someone else there, a man. He looked at me. And then I was walking back to the truck and I couldn't remember the walk, just the man's eyes and then being back in the driver's seat." Marcus felt a chill. "What are you saying?" "I don't think I'm me anymore. Or I'm me, but there's something else too. Inside me, watching through my eyes, using my body but not quite understanding how it works." James sat up, his movements jerky, uncoordinated. He looked at his hands like he'd never seen them before, flexing his fingers with the fascinated confusion of someone learning to use a new tool. "We need to get you to a hospital," Marcus said. "No." James's voice was different now, flatter, emotionless. "No hospitals, keep driving, must reach Seattle." "James, you're not—" "Must reach Seattle." The words came out mechanically, without inflection, without humanity. James stood up, swaying slightly, and moved toward the driver's seat. Marcus blocked his way. "You're not driving. Not like this." James looked at him with eyes that reflected light wrong, that seemed somehow deeper than they should be. "Marcus Reed, brother of Sarah Reed, married 7 years, 2 children, lives in Atlanta, drives trucks with James Wilson, trusts James Wilson. James Wilson says keep driving." The recitation of facts delivered in that flat, mechanical voice was terrifying. This thing wearing James's face was trying to manipulate him, using personal information to establish credibility but doing it wrong, like a computer program that had learned about human relationships from a textbook but didn't understand the emotional weight behind the words. Marcus grabbed his phone and stepped outside the truck. He called Sarah. "Something's wrong with James. I think he's having some kind of breakdown. He's acting strange, saying weird things." "What kind of things?" "Like he's not himself. Like something's inside him, controlling him. I know how it sounds, but—" James appeared in the driver's side door, standing there watching Marcus with those wrong eyes. "Marcus Reed is making a phone call. Marcus Reed is concerned. Marcus Reed should not be concerned. Everything is normal. Keep driving." Sarah heard the voice through the phone. "That doesn't sound like James. Marcus, get away from him. Find somewhere safe and call the police." But before Marcus could respond, James moved, impossibly fast, closing the distance and snatching the phone from Marcus's hand. He threw it onto the highway where a passing car crushed it. "Must reach Seattle. No delays, no calls." James climbed into the driver's seat. "Marcus Reed will sleep. Marcus Reed is tired." And Marcus was tired. Suddenly, overwhelmingly exhausted, like every hour of missed sleep from the past week had hit him at once. His legs buckled and he had to grab the door handle to keep from falling. Something was wrong with his body, with his mind, like James, or whatever was inside James, was somehow projecting this fatigue, making him unable to resist. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, unable to stay on his feet. James started the truck and drove back onto the highway, heading west. Marcus tried to stay awake, tried to think of a way to escape or get help, but his eyelids were too heavy. He drifted off, slumping against the door. When Marcus woke, they were in Wyoming. The sun was setting, painting the plains orange and purple. James was still driving, still had that mechanical precision, that inhuman focus. Marcus checked the GPS. They'd driven straight through, no stops, covering nearly 1,000 miles in the time Marcus had been unconscious. "James, please, whatever's happening to you, we can fix it, we can get help." James turned to look at him, taking his eyes off the road for far too long, staring with that flat affect. "James Wilson is fine. James Wilson is better than before. James Wilson has purpose now. James Wilson will reach Seattle." "What's in Seattle?" "Others. Others who are also better. Others who have purpose. Marcus Reed could have purpose too. Marcus Reed could be better." Marcus understood then. This was some kind of infection, some kind of parasite or entity that had taken over James at that rest stop in Nashville, and it wanted to spread, wanted to reach others of its kind in Seattle, wanted to make Marcus another host, another body controlled by whatever this thing was. Marcus waited until James was focused on the road, then quietly opened the passenger door. They were doing 70 miles per hour. It would hurt, might kill him, but staying in the truck meant becoming like James. Marcus braced himself and rolled out. He hit the asphalt hard, the world tumbling and spinning. Pain exploded through his body as he rolled across the shoulder and into the grass. When he stopped, he couldn't move his left arm and his ribs felt broken. But he was alive and away from the truck. Marcus watched the truck continue west, not slowing, not stopping. James, or the thing wearing James, didn't care that he'd lost his passenger. The mission was Seattle. Nothing else mattered. Marcus flagged down a passing car, got to a hospital, called the authorities. He tried to report what had happened, but how could he explain? His partner had been taken over by something, was driving to Seattle to meet others like him, and Marcus had jumped from a moving truck to escape. They treated his injuries and assumed he was confused from head trauma. Marcus never learned what happened to James. The truck and its driver disappeared somewhere between Wyoming and Seattle, never arriving at the scheduled delivery, never found by police. James Wilson vanished along with the truck and the cargo as if he'd driven off the edge of reality. Marcus doesn't drive team anymore. He goes solo, trusts no one, and avoids rest areas in Nashville. But sometimes, late at night, he sees trucks being driven with that same mechanical precision, that same inhuman focus. And he wonders how many drivers out there have been replaced by something else. How many are carrying passengers towards Seattle or some other gathering point. How many Marcus Reeds are riding alongside things that wear familiar faces but have stopped being human. James is still out there. Marcus is certain of it. Still driving, still heading west, still trying to reach Seattle and whatever waits for him there. And Marcus can't help but wonder if one night he'll see that familiar truck in his mirrors, James still behind the wheel, still moving with that mechanical precision, still serving a purpose that Marcus escaped, but will never truly understand. Story 5. The Exit That Leads Nowhere. Rebecca Torres had been a commercial driver for 12 years, and she thought she knew every highway, every exit, every route between Los Angeles and Phoenix. At 36, she'd driven that corridor hundreds of times, could navigate it half asleep, barely needed GPS anymore. But in October of 2023, Rebecca took an exit she'd never seen before, and what should have been a simple detour became a journey into a space that shouldn't exist. She was hauling produce from the Central Valley to a distribution center in Tempe, taking I-10 east through the desert, Around 9 p.m., just past the California-Arizona border, Rebecca's GPS indicated heavy traffic ahead due to an accident. It suggested an alternate route, directing her to take exit 78B. Rebecca didn't remember an exit 78B, but the GPS was insistent, and she trusted the technology. The exit ramp appeared right where it should, clearly marked, well-maintained. She took it, following a two-lane road that curved away from the interstate, heading north into empty desert. The GPS showed the detour route clearly. She'd follow this road for 8 miles, then rejoin I-10 past the accident site. Simple enough. But after 5 miles of driving through absolute darkness, no lights except her headlights, no other vehicles, Rebecca started to feel uneasy. The road was too perfect, too straight, no variation in grade or curve. And there were no landmarks, no signs, nothing to indicate where she was or where she was going. After 10 miles, 2 miles past where she should have rejoined the highway, Rebecca's GPS lost signal. The screen went blank, showing only searching for satellites. Her cell phone had no signal either. Even her CB radio produced only static. Rebecca kept driving, assuming the highway had to be ahead somewhere. But the road continued endlessly into the darkness, arrow straight, unchanging. No exits, no intersections, no way to turn around, just the two-lane road stretching forward and backward infinitely. After 30 minutes of driving this impossible road, Rebecca saw lights ahead. A town, maybe, or at least some sign of civilization. But as she got closer, the lights resolved into something strange. A rest area, but not like any rest area she'd ever seen. The building was too modern, too clean, with architectural features that seemed futuristic. And the parking lot was full of vehicles, but they were all wrong. Cars and trucks with designs she didn't recognize, shapes that seemed aerodynamic beyond current technology. Rebecca pulled in, deeply unsettled. She got out of her truck and walked toward the building. The air felt different here, thinner with a metallic taste. The sky looked wrong too. Stars in positions she didn't recognize, constellations she'd never seen despite years of night driving through clear desert skies. Inside the rest area, people moved through the convenience store and dining area, but something about them was off. Their clothes were just slightly wrong, styles that didn't quite match any current fashion. Their behavior was too coordinated, too efficient, moving with a precision that suggested they were following invisible paths, predetermined routes through the space. Rebecca approached the information desk, where a woman sat reading something on a tablet that was too thin, too flexible to be any current technology. "Excuse me, where am I? I took exit 78B off I-10 and I don't know where this road goes." The woman looked up and her eyes were wrong. Too large, too reflective, almost like mirrors. "You're on Route 78B. It connects I-10 to itself." "What does that mean?" "You took an exit that leads back to where you were, but through a different space. This road exists outside your normal geography, a shortcut through a folded dimension. You'll rejoin I-10 eventually, but you're traveling through somewhere else to get there." Rebecca's mind couldn't process this. "That's not possible," the woman smiled. "Most travelers don't notice. Their vehicles move through this space automatically, rejoin the highway, continue their journeys without realizing they've briefly left normal reality. But you're aware, which means you've been here too long. The longer you remain conscious of this place, the harder it becomes to leave." "How do I get back?" "Keep driving. Don't stop, don't sleep, don't acknowledge this place too much. Just drive until the road returns you to I-10, but hurry. If you're still here when the road cycles, every 6 hours, you'll be trapped permanently, forced to travel this route forever with all the others who couldn't leave in time." Rebecca ran back to her truck, started the engine, and drove. The rest area disappeared behind her, and the road continued through the dark. But now Rebecca noticed things she hadn't before. Other vehicles on the road with her, their headlights visible, but the vehicles themselves somehow transparent, ghostly. They were the ones who hadn't left in time, who'd been trapped on Route 78B, doomed to drive forever through this folded space. Rebecca checked her clock. She'd been on this road for 45 minutes. If it cycled every 6 hours, she had 5 hours and 15 minutes to find her way back to I-10 before she joined the ghosts. She drove faster, pushing 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. The road remained perfectly straight, perfectly smooth, allowing speeds no normal highway would permit. And as she drove, she saw more rest areas, more impossible towns, more glimpses of the strange space she was traveling through. Gas stations that sold fuel she didn't recognize, diners serving customers who'd been dead for decades, truck stops where vehicles from different eras parked side by side. After 2 hours of driving at dangerous speeds, Rebecca's GPS suddenly activated. "In 2 miles, merge onto I-10 East." The voice was normal, calm, as if nothing strange had happened. The merge appeared ahead, a ramp that curved back toward the familiar interstate. Rebecca took it, and suddenly she was back on I-10, traffic around her. Mile markers showing she was exactly where she should have been if she'd driven straight through without the detour. Rebecca's clock showed 11:15 p.m. She'd left I-10 at 9 p.m. The detour had taken 2 hours and 15 minutes, but according to her GPS log, she'd only been off the highway for 8 minutes. Time moved differently on Route 78B, hours compressing into minutes, distance folding through impossible geometry. Rebecca completed her delivery to Tempe, but she couldn't stop thinking about the road, the rest areas, the people trapped in that folded space. She researched online, found scattered reports of drivers mentioning strange detours, impossible rest stops, roads that existed but shouldn't. Most people dismissed these stories as hallucinations or hoaxes. But Rebecca knew they were real. She drives that route regularly, I-10 between California and Arizona. Sometimes she sees exit 78B, the ramp appearing in her peripheral vision, her GPS suggesting it as an alternate route. But Rebecca never takes it again. She'd rather sit in traffic for hours than risk returning to that place, that road that leads nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. That space between spaces where time moves wrong and trapped drivers circle forever, unable to find their way back to the real highway. Rebecca knows she was lucky. She'd been aware enough to question the reality of Route 78B, fast enough to escape before the road cycled and trapped her permanently. But she wonders about the ghost vehicles she saw, the transparent trucks driven by transparent drivers who'd made the same choice she had but hadn't escaped in time. How long had they been driving that route? Decades? Centuries? Forever? And she wonders what would have happened if she'd stayed at that rest area, talked to more people, tried to understand the place instead of fleeing. Would she have learned something, discovered some secret of the universe? Or would she have lost her chance to escape, become another ghost on Route 78B, another transparent vehicle visible to future travelers who'd made the same mistake? Rebecca will never know. But every time she drives I-10 at night, she watches for exit 78B, ready to ignore her GPS if it suggests that route, determined never to return to the road that leads nowhere. The highway that exists in folded space. The detour that becomes a prison for those who remain too long in a place that should never have existed at all. Story 6. The Voice on the Radio. Leonard Bishop had been a trucker for 28 years, and in all that time he'd never felt truly alone on the road. The CB radio was constant company, voices of other drivers sharing traffic information, jokes, complaints, the mundane chatter that made endless highway miles bearable. At 54, Leonard was considering retirement, thinking maybe it was time to leave the road behind. But in November of 2023, Leonard encountered something on the CB that made him question not just his career, but the nature of reality itself. He was hauling machinery from Minneapolis to Billings, taking I-94 west through North Dakota on a brutally cold November night. Temperature outside was well below zero, wind howling across the plains, creating whiteout conditions that made driving treacherous. Leonard was alone on the highway. Sensible people had pulled over to wait out the storm. But Leonard had a deadline, and he'd driven through worse conditions before. Around midnight, his CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, this is Lost Soul calling for any northbound traffic. Does anyone copy?" The voice was male, young, with a strange quality that Leonard couldn't quite identify. A hollow echo like the speaker was in a large, empty space. Leonard grabbed his mic. "This is Big L, westbound on I-94. You said northbound? You looking for I-29? Negative, Big L. I'm northbound on I-94. At least I think I am. I'm not sure anymore. I've been driving for a long time, a very long time." Leonard checked his mirrors. No headlights behind him, no vehicles ahead. "I don't see you, Lost Soul. What's your 20? "I don't know. Somewhere in North Dakota. I've been passing the same mile markers for I don't know how long. Days, weeks. The clock in my cab stopped working. My phone's dead. I can't tell if I'm moving or if the world is moving around me." Leonard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What's your name? When did you start having this problem?" "Name's Tyler. Tyler Morrison. I started this drive on November 4th, 2015. I was hauling grain from Fargo to Minot, but I never made it to Minot. I've been on this highway ever since, just driving, trying to find the exit that doesn't come." 2015, 8 years ago. Leonard's hands tightened on the wheel. "Tyler, that's not possible. You can't have been driving for 8 years. "I know, but I have. The same road, the same storm, the same darkness. I've passed gas stations, but they're always closed. I've seen other trucks, but they disappear when I try to reach them. You're the first person who's responded to my calls in I don't know how long. Maybe you're real. Maybe you can help me." Leonard didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but the voice on the radio was desperate, terrified, and something about it felt genuine. "Tyler, I'm going to do a search for you. Give me a second." Leonard used his phone, still had signal despite the storm, and searched for Tyler Morrison in Fargo. What he found made his blood run cold. News articles from November 2015 reporting that a 23-year-old truck driver named Tyler Morrison had vanished on I-94 between Fargo and Minot during a blizzard. His truck had never been found. No evidence of an accident, no trace of the driver. Just gone, as if the storm had swallowed him entirely. "Tyler, I found articles about you. You were reported missing in November 2015. They searched for weeks but never found you or your truck." Silence on the radio. Then Tyler's voice, quieter, broken. "So I'm dead? Is that what this is? Am I dead? I don't know what you are, but you're somewhere I can't see, driving a road that might not be the same I-94 I'm on. Then how are we talking? How can you hear me if I'm not real, if I'm just gone?" Leonard didn't have an answer. He drove through the whiteout, trying to make sense of the impossible conversation. "Tyler, do you remember the accident? Do you remember what happened?" "I remember the storm getting worse. I remember my visibility going to zero. I remember deciding to pull over, but I couldn't find the shoulder, couldn't see anything. And then, nothing. Just the road continuing, the storm never ending, the drive never finishing. I've been trying to reach Minot for 8 years. 47 miles. That's all it should have been. 47 miles. Leonard thought about the nature of time, of space, of the highways that connect cities across empty plains. What if Tyler's truck had somehow slipped out of normal reality during that storm? What if he was trapped in a moment, endlessly repeating, driving through a November night that never ended. Tyler, what if you tried stopping? Just pulling over and waiting instead of driving? I've tried. I stop, but the road keeps moving, or I keep moving. I can't tell the difference anymore. Everything outside my windshield is the same, whether my wheels are turning or not. The storm, the darkness, the endless white, it's all the same. Leonard had an idea. Tyler, I'm going to give you coordinates, not a place, but a moment. I'm westbound on I-94 at mile marker 242 at exactly 12:17 a.m. on November 18th, 2023. If you're trapped in time, maybe you can aim for my position. Try to intersect with my moment instead of staying in yours. How do I do that? I don't know. But you've been driving for 8 years. You must have some control over where you're going, even if you can't escape entirely. Focus on my voice. Focus on now, on this moment, on 2023 instead of 2015. Leonard drove slowly, watching his mirrors, listening to the CB. Tyler's voice continued, describing his attempts to focus, to navigate temporally instead of spatially. I see something. Lights ahead, red lights like taillights. Is that you? Leonard checked his position. Mile marker 242, time, 12:17 a.m. Yeah, that could be me. Can you reach me? I'm trying. It's like driving through water, through resistance. Everything's pushing back, trying to keep me in 2015, but I can see you. I can see your truck. Leonard looked in his side mirror. For just a moment, he saw headlights, a truck pulling alongside him in the left lane, an old Kenworth, the kind they made in the mid-2010s. And in the cab, barely visible through the snow, a young man with a desperate expression reaching out as if trying to touch something real. Then the truck flickered and vanished. Tyler's voice on the CB became distant, fading. I can't hold it. It's pulling me back to 2015, back to the storm. Tyler, fight it. You're so close. Thank you for trying. Thank you for believing me. Tell my family. Tell them I didn't just disappear. Tell them I've been trying to get home. Tell them... The voice cut off. Static filled the CB. Leonard called out, but no response came. Tyler Morrison had slipped back into whatever temporal prison held him, back to driving endlessly through a 2015 blizzard, trying to complete a 47-mile journey that would never end. Leonard pulled over, hands shaking. He called the number listed in the old news articles, reaching Tyler's mother. She answered, suspicious of the late-night call from an unknown number. Mrs. Morrison, you don't know me, but I just spoke with your son, Tyler. On the CB radio, he's trapped somewhere, still driving, still trying to reach Minot. She was silent for a long moment. Someone calls every year or two claiming they've seen Tyler or heard him. Are you another cruel person looking to hurt our family? No. I'm a trucker. I don't expect you to believe me. But Tyler wanted you to know he's been trying to get home. He didn't just disappear. He's somewhere, still driving, still trying. Leonard heard her crying soft sobs through the phone. I've always felt like he was still out there, like he was calling to us, but we couldn't hear him. Thank you for telling me. Even if it's not real, even if he's gone, thank you for letting me believe for one more night that my son is still trying to come home. Leonard completed his delivery to Billings, but the encounter with Tyler Morrison's voice haunted him. He researched other cases of missing truckers, drivers who'd vanished during storms or in remote areas, never found, never explained. There were dozens, hundreds over the decades, and Leonard wondered how many of them were like Tyler, trapped in temporal loops, driving endless highways through frozen moments, trying desperately to reach destinations they'd never arrive at. Leonard retired 6 months later. He couldn't drive those highways anymore without thinking of Tyler, without imagining all the lost drivers circling in their private hells, calling out on CB radios that reached across time but not space, speaking to living truckers from years in the past, begging for help that couldn't be given. But sometimes late at night, Leonard turns on his old CB radio. He listens to the channels, waiting, and occasionally he hears them. The lost voices, drivers trapped in storms or accidents or moments of temporal distortion, still calling out, still trying to complete deliveries that will never end. Tyler's voice comes through sometimes, still heading north on I-94, still trying to reach Minot, still trapped in November 2015. Leonard responds when he can, offers what comfort a voice can provide to drivers who exist in time but not in place. He can't save them. He can't pull them back into normal reality. But he can listen, can acknowledge their existence, can tell them they're not forgotten. It's the least he can do for the lost souls on the highway. The voices on the radio that call from nowhere, from the spaces between moments, from the roads that loop, forever through frozen time. And Leonard knows that one day maybe someone will hear his voice on the CB too. Because the highways are strange and time doesn't always move forward, and sometimes drivers don't disappear. They just get stuck in places where the road never ends and the destination never arrives, calling out forever to anyone who might listen, hoping for rescue that will never come. Story 7. The Bridge Between Nowhere. Thomas Brennan had been driving trucks for 34 years. Longer than most drivers lasted in a profession that wore down bodies and minds with equal brutality. At 59 years old, Thomas was planning to retire within the year, looking forward to finally settling down with his wife in a small house they'd bought in Tennessee. But in September of 2023, Thomas drove across a bridge that shouldn't have existed, and the experience made him question whether he'd ever truly understood the geography of the country he'd been crossing for over 3 decades. Thomas was hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Little Rock, a route he'd driven at least 100 times during his career. The standard path followed Interstate 69 south through Indiana and then cut west across Illinois and Missouri before dropping into Arkansas. Thomas knew every mile of this route, every town, every truck stop, every quirk of the road. He could have driven it blindfolded. But on this particular trip, in the early hours of a foggy September morning, Thomas encountered something that made him realize how little he actually knew about the highways he'd been traveling for decades. He was in southern Illinois, somewhere between Mount Vernon and the Kentucky border, driving through dense fog that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet. The fog was thick enough that Thomas had slowed to 45 miles per hour, his hazard lights flashing, giving himself extra reaction time in case slower vehicles or obstacles appeared suddenly in the murk ahead. Around 3:30 in the morning, Thomas saw a sign emerge from the fog. Bridge ahead, reduce speed. Standard highway signage, nothing unusual. Thomas checked his mirrors. No traffic behind him, no vehicles visible anywhere in the fog. He was alone on the road, which wasn't surprising given the hour and the weather conditions. The bridge appeared gradually, materializing out of the fog like something from a dream. It was a steel truss bridge, old-style construction that reminded Thomas of bridges built in the 1930s and 40s. The bridge was narrow, just 2 lanes with no shoulders, the steel framework rising on either side like a tunnel of metal girders. Thomas couldn't see the far end through the fog, couldn't even estimate the bridge's length. What struck Thomas as odd was that he didn't remember any bridge at this location. He'd driven this stretch of highway dozens of times, and while there were several river crossings along the route, Thomas was certain none of them involved a narrow steel truss bridge. The bridges on this highway were modern concrete structures, wide and well-maintained, nothing like the ancient-looking span ahead of him. But Thomas was tired. It was foggy, and he'd been driving for 9 hours straight. Maybe he was misremembering the route. Maybe this bridge had always been here and he'd simply never noticed it before, the way you could drive past the same landmark for years without consciously registering it. Thomas drove onto the bridge, his tires making a different sound on the metal grating of the roadway, a rhythmic humming that created an almost musical tone. The bridge's steel framework enclosed him on both sides, blocking any view of what the bridge crossed. Thomas couldn't see water or ground below, couldn't determine whether he was crossing a river, a valley, or something else. The bridge seemed to go on longer than any bridge Thomas remembered on this route. He'd been driving for what felt like several minutes at 45 miles per hour, which meant he'd covered at least 3 miles. But the bridge continued ahead, disappearing into fog, with no sign of the far end. Thomas checked his odometer, noting the reading, and continued forward. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At 45 miles per hour, Thomas had now driven approximately 7 miles on this bridge, and he still couldn't see the far end. That was impossible. There were no 7-mile-long bridges in southern Illinois. The longest bridge in the state was maybe 2 miles, spanning the Mississippi River. Thomas's unease deepened into genuine fear. He considered stopping, turning around, going back the way he came, but the bridge was only 2 lanes wide with no shoulder. There was nowhere to turn around, and backing up for 7 miles in dense fog seemed more dangerous than continuing forward. The fog inside the bridge's framework seemed denser than it had been on the approach. Or perhaps the enclosed steel structure was trapping moisture and making visibility even worse. Thomas could barely see 20 feet ahead now. Just the steel girders on either side and the metal grating beneath his wheels, all of it suffused with gray fog that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Thomas grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Lone Star. Anyone out there copy? I'm on a bridge in southern Illinois and I need some information about this crossing. How long is this damn bridge?" Static answered him. Thomas tried different channels, called out multiple times, but received no response. His CB was functioning. He could hear the carrier wave, could see the signal indicator lighting up when he transmitted. But no one was answering. Either there were no other drivers within range, or something about the bridge was blocking communication. Thomas checked his GPS. The screen showed him on Interstate 24, which was wrong. He should have been on I-69 or possibly I-57. The GPS couldn't seem to lock onto his position properly. The blue dot jumping erratically across the screen, sometimes showing him in Illinois, sometimes in Tennessee, sometimes in locations that made no geographical sense. 15 minutes on the bridge. Thomas had now driven over 11 miles at his current speed, and the bridge continued ahead with no variation. No change in structure, no indication he was approaching an end. The steel framework remained constant, the fog remained impenetrable, and the musical humming of his tires on the metal grating continued its hypnotic rhythm. Thomas's rational mind insisted this was impossible. Bridges didn't extend for 11 miles through fog without ending. He must be experiencing some kind of hallucination, some fugue state brought on by fatigue and the disorienting effects of the fog. Maybe he'd fallen asleep and was dreaming while his truck rolled forward on cruise control. But Thomas didn't feel asleep. He felt hyper-aware, every sense heightened by adrenaline and fear. He could feel the steering wheel under his hands, feel the vibration of the truck's engine, smell the diesel fuel and the metallic scent of the bridge's steel framework. This was real, whatever it was. 20 minutes, 15 miles of bridge if Thomas's calculations were correct. He was crossing something that shouldn't exist, traveling through a space that violated every rule of geography and engineering. Then Thomas noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The steel framework on both sides of the bridge was changing. Subtly at first, but increasingly obvious as he continued forward. The girders were becoming older, more corroded, covered in rust and decay. Rivets were missing from joints. Entire sections of framework looked ready to collapse. The bridge was aging as Thomas drove across it, or he was traveling backward through time, seeing the bridge as it had been decades ago, or would be decades in the future. The decay suggested the latter. He was seeing the bridge's future, watching it deteriorate toward inevitable collapse. Thomas pressed harder on the accelerator, increasing his speed to 60 miles per hour despite the fog and the dangerous conditions. He needed to get off this bridge before it decayed completely, before the structure failed and sent his truck plummeting into whatever abyss the bridge spanned. The steel framework continued to worsen. Rust covered everything now. Girders sagged visibly. Thomas could see cracks in the metal, stress fractures that suggested imminent failure. The musical humming of his tires had changed pitch, becoming discordant, almost like screaming metal. And then Thomas saw something through gaps in the framework that made him understand the true horror of his situation. Below the bridge, barely visible through the fog and the gaps between girders, Thomas glimpsed what the bridge was crossing. It wasn't water. It wasn't land. It was nothing. Absolute emptiness, a void that had no bottom, no features, just infinite darkness extending in all directions. The bridge wasn't crossing a river or valley. It was crossing between realities, between locations that weren't geographically connected in normal space. Thomas was traveling through a liminal passage that connected two points that should have been impossible to connect, driving across a bridge that existed outside normal geography. The realization came with a flood of understanding. This was why the bridge seemed endless, because it wasn't traveling through normal three-dimensional space. It was taking a shortcut through some other dimension, some space between spaces, connecting distant locations through a passage that normal physics didn't allow. Thomas had driven onto a bridge between nowhere and nowhere, and he was trapped in the crossing until the bridge decided to release him. If it ever did. The steel framework was almost completely deteriorated now, more rust than metal, held together by forces that had nothing to do with structural integrity. Thomas could see through the framework to the void beyond, could feel his truck suspended over absolute nothingness by a bridge that defied every law of engineering. 30 minutes on the bridge, over 22 miles traveled at his current speed. Thomas's fuel gauge had dropped noticeably. He'd burned through at least 3 gallons of diesel crossing this impossible span. His truck was aging too, experiencing time and wear even as the bridge itself aged around him. Thomas prayed, something he hadn't done since childhood, asking whatever deity might listen to let him reach the end of this bridge, to let him return to normal roads and normal space where physics made sense and bridges had beginnings and ends. And then, finally, after 35 minutes of crossing, Thomas saw light ahead. Not the gray fog he'd been driving through, but actual daylight, morning sun breaking through mist. The far end of the bridge was emerging from the fog, a concrete abutment that looked modern and solid and real. Thomas pressed his accelerator to the floor, his truck surging forward despite the load, racing toward that distant light. The decayed steel framework flashed past on both sides, rust and corrosion and structural failure held together by nothing but momentum and hope. Thomas's truck burst off the bridge onto solid concrete highway, the transition so abrupt it felt like breaking through a membrane. The steel framework disappeared behind him, swallowed by fog, and Thomas found himself on a normal highway with clear skies overhead and morning light illuminating familiar landscape. Thomas pulled onto the shoulder immediately and stopped, his whole body shaking. He climbed out of his cab and looked back at where he'd just emerged, expecting to see the bridge still there, still visible. But there was no bridge, just normal highway stretching behind him, no fog, no steel framework, no indication that a bridge existed at this location. Thomas walked back along the shoulder, looking for the bridge approach, the abutment he'd just driven off of. Nothing. The highway was continuous concrete, no seams, no transitions, no evidence of a bridge crossing. Thomas checked his GPS. It showed him on Interstate 24 near Paducah, Kentucky. But that was impossible. Thomas had been on I-69 in Illinois when he'd entered the bridge. He'd driven approximately 25 miles across the bridge at an average of 45 miles per hour. But somehow he'd emerged over 200 miles southeast of where he'd entered, in a completely different state. The bridge had transported him across space as well as time. The 35 minutes he'd spent crossing had moved him 200 miles southeast, as if the bridge compressed distance, connected locations that should have required hours of normal driving. Thomas checked his truck's systems. The odometer showed he'd driven 27 miles since entering the bridge. The physical distance traveled across the span itself, but his GPS showed he'd moved 200 miles southeast from his previous position. The bridge's distance didn't correspond to actual geographical distance traveled. Thomas's fuel gauge confirmed he'd burned fuel equivalent to about 27 miles of driving, not 200 miles. The bridge had been real, had existed as a physical structure he'd crossed, but it had existed outside normal space, connecting distant points through some kind of spatial compression or dimensional shortcut. Thomas sat on the shoulder of I-24 for over an hour, trying to process what had happened. He'd entered a bridge in Illinois and exited in Kentucky, traveling 200 miles in 35 minutes by crossing a span that existed between normal locations that connected points separated by vast distances through a passage outside conventional geography. Eventually, Thomas continued his journey, though he was now on a completely different route than he'd planned. He was already in Kentucky halfway to Little Rock, despite having only driven since Detroit for what his logs showed as 10 hours. Not nearly enough time to cover the distance. When Thomas finally delivered his load in Little Rock, he was a full day ahead of schedule. The delivery supervisor was confused, checking Thomas's pickup timestamp from Detroit and calculating that Thomas couldn't possibly have made the trip in the time indicated. But Thomas's logs were accurate. His truck's electronic systems confirmed the timeline, and the cargo was delivered intact and on time. Actually early by 24 hours. Thomas tried to report the bridge to his company, to highway authorities, to anyone who might investigate, but he couldn't provide a location. He didn't know where the bridge entrance was. It had simply appeared in fog on a route he'd driven hundreds of times. He couldn't mark it on a map, couldn't give coordinates, couldn't even confirm which highway he'd been on when he'd encountered it. Officials listened politely and concluded Thomas had become disoriented in the fog, had taken a wrong turn onto an alternate route that happened to be faster, and had simply misremembered or miscalculated his position. The idea that he'd crossed a bridge between nowhere that compressed space was dismissed as fatigue-induced confusion. But Thomas knew what he'd experienced. He'd driven across a bridge that existed outside normal geography, that connected distant locations through passages in space that shouldn't exist. The bridge was real. He'd spent 35 minutes crossing it, had burned fuel, had experienced the physical act of driving across steel framework suspended over a void. Over the following weeks, Thomas researched similar accounts. He found scattered reports from other drivers describing bridges that appeared in fog or darkness, bridges that seemed longer than they should be. Bridges that deposited drivers in locations far from where they'd entered. The reports were dismissed as urban legends or hallucinations, but Thomas recognized the patterns. Other drivers had encountered similar passages. Bridges between nowhere that compressed distance and connected distant points. Thomas theorized that these bridges were natural phenomena, or perhaps ancient infrastructure, passages that existed in spatial dimensions humans couldn't normally perceive. During certain conditions, fog, darkness, specific times, the passages became accessible, appearing as bridges that drivers could cross, transporting them across vast distances in minutes instead of hours. The passages were dangerous. Thomas had seen the deterioration, had witnessed the structural decay, suggesting the bridges were failing, collapsing, becoming unstable. Crossing one was a gamble. You might emerge safely 200 miles from where you entered, Or you might find yourself trapped on a deteriorating span suspended over void, with no way forward or back. Thomas Brennan retired from trucking 2 months after the bridge incident. He couldn't continue driving, couldn't trust that normal highways would remain normal, that familiar routes wouldn't suddenly open passages to places between nowhere. The experience had broken his confidence in the geographical stability of the world he'd been crossing for 34 years. Thomas spent his retirement researching the bridges, compiling accounts from other drivers, trying to map where the passages appeared and where they led. He created a database of reports looking for patterns that might predict when and where the bridges between nowhere became accessible. He found some patterns. The bridges appeared most frequently during fog or heavy rain, usually at night, usually on routes drivers had traveled many times before. They connected locations that were geographically distant but somehow related, major transportation hubs, places where many routes converged, locations with high volumes of traveler energy and intention. Thomas theorized that the bridges were like wormholes, shortcuts through space created by the collective intention of millions of travelers wishing to reach distant destinations quickly. The bridges manifested where enough desire and intention had accumulated, creating actual physical passages that compressed distance and allowed rapid travel between points. But the bridges were unstable, maintained by belief and use, deteriorating when travelers stopped believing in them or stopped crossing them. The decay Thomas had witnessed was the bridge beginning to fail, its structure held together by increasingly tenuous connections to reality. Thomas never crossed another bridge between nowhere. He retired, settled in Tennessee, and tried to live a normal life. But he couldn't forget those 35 minutes suspended over void, crossing impossible distance on a deteriorating span held together by forces beyond engineering, traveling through space that existed between normal locations, emerging in a different state 200 miles from where he'd entered. The bridge between nowhere taught Thomas that geography isn't as fixed as maps suggest, that distance is sometimes negotiable, and that the highways drivers cross every day sometimes intersect with passages that exist outside normal space. Bridges between nowhere that connect distant points through dimensional shortcuts that compress hundreds of miles into spans of 27 miles, allowing drivers who enter them to travel faster and farther than physics should allow, crossing voids that have no bottom and emerging in locations they couldn't have reached in the time elapsed, delivered early to destinations they'd expected to reach days later, with memories of deteriorating steel framework and infinite darkness below, and the certain knowledge that they'd driven across something that shouldn't exist but did, a bridge between two nowheres that somehow connected everywhere. And Thomas wonders how many other drivers have crossed those bridges without realizing it, have driven through fog onto spans that compress distance, have emerged 200 miles from where they entered thinking they'd just lost track of time or gotten confused about their route, never understanding that they'd briefly left normal geography and traveled through passages between nowhere, crossing voids on bridges held together by collective intention and luck, driving through dimensions between dimensions, covering in minutes what should have taken hours, and arriving at destinations impossibly early with fuel burned and distance traveled that doesn't match the miles shown on GPS. Living proof that the highways of America sometimes connect to roads that exist outside normal space, bridges that span between nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, passages that appear in fog for those unlucky or fortunate enough to encounter them and survive the crossing from one nowhere to another nowhere that somehow becomes exactly where you needed to be, delivered early and intact with only memories of steel framework deteriorating into rust and void, stretching infinite below to prove the journey was real.